So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Stella Nordhagen, who is a research lead with GAIN, where she oversees research related to food systems in Africa and Asia. Her areas of research interest include market-based approaches to improving diets and nutrition, food supply chains, food environments, food choice, and linkages between nutrition and environmental sustainability. She's got an MPhil and a PhD from the University of Cambridge. And with those areas of research interest, it's no surprise that she's working on food policy coherence, addressing these kind of interlinked food-related challenges, which requires integrated approaches. And we're striving with food systems policy coherence to reach policies across sectors to be aligned as opposed to working against one another. So we know that the policy coherence is very appealing and has often been talked about, not least of which by ourselves in the Centre for Food Policy for a long time. And we know that in practice it's very difficult to assess. And this is why GAIN have been working on this new tool. So I'm going to hand over to Stella to talk about the tool, where it's been used and how it's been used. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more. Thank you, Stella.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Rebecca. And thanks everybody for joining today. It's really exciting to be able to share this piece of work with you. And I hope it proves to be something that's interesting to you in your own work as well. So just to kick off, we will be talking today about diagnosing food systems policy coherence. And I'm speaking today on behalf of a big group of people with GAIN and also with Academia 2063, which is a Pan-African food policy research think tank that have worked over the past couple of years to develop this new tool. Now, Rebecca already started getting into this a little bit, but before we get into the tool itself, I think it's important to remember why do we care about policy coherence when it comes to food systems? There are so many different topics that we could worry about, learn about, study when it comes to sustainable development and when it comes to food. So why is policy coherence such an important one? Well, really the root of this as an essential topic for transforming food systems is in the fact that food and the food systems from which food comes is central to so many different shared goals that we're trying to achieve. We all know very well, of course, that food is central to achieving human health. Having a healthy diet, being well nourished is one of the cornerstones of human health and well-being. And when that's not in place, we see many challenges. We know that almost a third of global deaths can be tied to different types of dietary risk factors around the world, and that there are many different opportunities we have for improving health by improving the foods that people eat. But food goes well beyond that. Food is also a source of livelihoods. Directly, it's thought that food systems employ about 1.2 billion people all over the world, and indirectly support almost 4 billion different households, many of those being in low and middle income countries. Through those diverse livelihoods, food systems serve as an engine for economic growth, and particularly in low and middle income countries again, where the agriculture and food sector can be a very large share of the economy and one of the important options for value addition. Food systems also intersect with environmental sustainability. We know that food systems are a source of about 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, and through that, they're an important driver of climate change. But they also affect many other environmental outcomes, things like water use and water quality, land use, local pollution like eutrophication of wetland ecosystems. And they also provide positive environmental services, providing important sources of biodiversity, maintaining key lands such as grazing lands for cattle in natural ecosystems. Food systems are also central to equity and social inclusion. Who has the right to food? Who can access food in affordable, accessible ways through public services like school meal programs? Who gets to have which jobs within food systems and who gets to benefit from higher incomes as a result? And finally, food systems are really central to many of the different cultures and traditions that all of us care about within our own cultures, but also as we travel around the world, as we interact with people from different cultures. Food is something that kind of creates that bridge and helps to cement different types of identity. So it's not really surprising that when we see all these different ways that food connects to so many of our different goals across society, that we really need to work to achieve multiple goals across multiple domains at once. If we want to achieve a holistic transformation of food systems to be better supporting of human health, of planetary health, and of economic and social development. That type of food system transformation can itself further achievement of each of these different goals separately and in combination. But while we know there's this need for a really holistic, integrated, interacting approach, the reality is that most policies around food systems are made in silos. They are agricultural policies that are made by agricultural experts within the agricultural system, looking primarily at agricultural goals. Or there are health policies that are made by health experts within health systems, looking at health goals. As a result of that siloing, it can often give rise to contradictions among different types of policies, even cases where one policy in one sector is actively undermining another policy in another sector because they're working at cross purposes while they're pursuing different goals. What we'd like to see instead of that is food systems policy coherence. So this is a definition that's adapted from a couple researchers that I imagine many of you on the call know very well, Kelly Parsons and Corinna Hawkes. And it describes food systems policy coherence as the alignment of policies affecting the food system with the aim of achieving diverse goals to ensure that policies designed to improve one food system outcome don't undermine others, and where it's possible, to take advantage of synergies across policy areas to achieve better outcomes for all. So as Rebecca mentioned, this is something that it's obviously a really appealing concept when we look at this. It's clearly something that we want to strive to achieve. We see it as resonant with many of the policy debates around the world today. And I think we can all recognize places where we know that it's not actually occurring, where these policies are working in incoherent ways as opposed to coherent ones. So while it's a really appealing concept, there still remains a bit of a gap in terms of how do we actually assess it? How do we actually know if it's happening or not? Historically, there hasn't really been all that much empirical research that has looked at the topic of food systems policy coherence. And where it has been done, it's usually been done through specific in-depth case studies that look at one particular area of policy within one particular context and do a very in-depth, detailed analysis of different policies using textual analysis and other types of approaches that really require a very high level of research expertise. That's obviously really helpful for advancing kind of the theory within this field and gaining in-depth understanding of particular issues in specific contexts. But when we think about a lot of the people who are really involved in the day-to-day work of trying to shape policies, whether those are civil servants who are writing policies, those in civil society maybe who are advocating for policy change, that type of in-depth, detailed research might not be something that all of them are able to actually take on within their particular policy contexts. So we set out to try and address that challenge, to try and develop and test an easy to use, widely applicable diagnostic tool that could be used to identify areas of coherence and incoherence among food systems policies, and importantly, to suggest options that policymakers have to improve coherence. So we wanted this to be something that was really specific, actionable, yet easy to use and widely applicable. And you might be able to already sensing that there's a bit of a tension here at the heart of what we were trying to do, in that policy coherence is a really complicated topic by its very definition, right? It's about interactions among different sectors. And to be able to make actionable, useful recommendations, one does need to grapple to a certain extent with that inherent complexity. But at the same time, we were really seeking to do something that was easy to use, widely applicable, not requiring in-depth expert knowledge. So that tension between simplifying and being overly simplistic is something that really guided our entire development of this tool, its piloting, and its application and adaptation into the final version that you'll see. So how did we go about developing this tool, keeping in mind that important balance between simple and not simplistic? Well, it wasn't easy. It was definitely one of those projects that seemed like a really good idea when it was written on paper at the beginning. And as we went through it, we kind of wondered, wow, how did we ever think this was going to be possible? We had a lot of iterations. We had some approaches that didn't work very well, and we had to go back to the drawing board. And we had several misturns that we took along the way before we ended up with something that we were happy with. But we did draw on a lot of different prior research that had been done on this topic and related topics. So particularly, we looked at work on policy coherence, including a review that was done last year by Dewey et al., looking at different types of research that had been done on the topic of food systems policy coherence and the different types of measurement approaches that they'd used. We looked at existing metrics and tools for assessing policy coherence outside of the food system space. Chief among these were the tools from the OECD on measuring policy coherence for sustainable development, as well as work that UNEP did on developing an indicator for SDG 17, which is about policy coherence for sustainable development. Neither of those had a food-specific focus, but they at least provide kind of a starting point, a scaffolding for thinking about how to assess this concept within the food space. We looked at different syntheses of current practices, of what was actually being done out there in the food policy world. Particularly, we drew on work from the UN Food Systems Summit, or UNFSS, including the different dialogues that happened in the run-up to that summit in 2021, which brought together many different stakeholders from around the world, articulating their preferences and visions for the food systems of the future, as well as work that the FAO did after the summit to analyze the different pathways or kind of vision statements, plans that came out from the different countries participating in the summit. We looked at research on food systems policy, and we looked at various existing secondary data sources. Wherever possible, we wanted to make it so people didn't have to go out and collect new primary data by digging through policies themselves, but could look to existing secondary sources and view that data through a bit of a policy coherence lens to come up with more efficient ways of answering some of the questions that we were interested in. Finally, we piloted the tool as we went along in kind of an iterative manner across the 10 countries where it's been applied. And each time we gleaned suggestions from the people who were involved with applying it, as well as from the stakeholders in countries who saw the results and had feedback on whether we'd gotten it right or whether maybe there were some things we'd missed or misinterpreted. And those suggestions were used to iteratively improve the tool over time. The focus of the tool that we settled on, again, a result of trying to balance that question of simple yet not simplistic, was to focus just on horizontal coherence. So that means coherence across different sectors at the same level of government, as opposed to vertical coherence, which is coherence across different levels of government, for example, from the national to the local level. We decided to focus just at the national level, so not looking at subnational policies, though a few exceptions to that, which I can talk more about in the questions if you're interested. And we decided to focus just on domestic policies, so not looking, aside from trade, at the ways in which a given country's policies might be affecting other countries, but focusing instead how those policies might be affecting that country itself. And we focused only on the present, though there are also important questions of policy coherence over time between present and future. And the initial focus that we decided to take was to look just at 10 low and middle income countries in Africa and Asia and focus the development of the tool primarily on that context. But over time, we did consider how it could be applied to high income country contexts and made some adjustments and also some kind of lessons learned about that applicability along the way, which I'm also happy to talk about a bit more in the Q&A. So what did the tool actually look like? What does the tool actually look like? Well, we settled on a modular approach with two different modules. The first module is about not policy coherence itself, but about the different structures and mechanisms that we think could support food policy coherence. So things that you can do within your governance structures that should make it more likely that you will end up with coherent outcomes. This module was really meant to be simple and rapid, so it just consists of about 30 questions across 6 sections. I'd say that for somebody who's really an expert in the policy context of their local country, they would probably be able to fill out this tool within a few hours based on the expert knowledge they already have, plus consulting a few sources. So it really is meant to be that simple. And it has these 6 sections. The first one is framework documents. So this is looking at questions like, does the country have any kind of a food policy, strategy, or food systems pathway that is not a sectoral policy like the agriculture or health policy, but is one that looks across food holistically, bringing together different sectors? That's an example of a question within that section. The second section looks at political commitment. So not just do those documents exist on paper, but is there some kind of an expressed high-level commitment among the country's leadership to following a food systems approach and doing that across electoral cycles, so it doesn't just end with that particular leader's time in power. The third section looked at the question of moving towards implementation and the extent to which there is capacity to be able to do that. So an example of a question from that section would be asking whether a country has in place an investment plan or a budget that would support the implementation of their policy or pathway. Having something written on paper of aspirations that you would like to do is one thing, but if there's not money to actually put it in place, it doesn't seem very likely that it will end up happening in practice. The fourth section looked at coordination structures. So basically seeing ways for people with different viewpoints or from different sectors to coordinate on issues related to food and food policy. Example question from that section would be whether the country has any kind of an ongoing forum or platform where members of government from different sectors, so from the agriculture sector and the food sector and the environment sector, all can get together to communicate and discuss issues of shared interest related to food. This section is looking at inclusivity and voice. So to what extent are the voices of different stakeholders involved in the process of developing and revising food policies? Example question from that is whether the country has in place any consultation mechanisms whereby it solicits feedback from the general public or from key stakeholder groups like civil society or academia on policies that are under development, and also whether or not it actually uses that input to revise those policies over time. The final section is looking at monitoring and accountability. So are there any mechanisms in place to really follow up on whether the things that have been promised to be done are being done, and if there's any way to hold stakeholders accountable for that happening or not happening? Example question from that section is asking whether there's any key performance indicators or key KPIs that specify what that policy or strategy is supposed to accomplish and provide clear targets for assessing whether or not it's achieving that goal. The second module, module 2, is where we really get into the meat of this question of policy coherence by looking at coherence between sectoral policies and cross-cutting food systems goals. This section seeks to identify where there are conflicts and where there are synergies among existing policies and goals. It's much heavier, so it's about 200 questions across 59 different sections. And the way that it's structured is by looking at 6 different goals that we think generally apply to food systems all around the world, maybe with different weights on them. And these were drawn from analysis of the pathways that came out of the UN Food Systems Summit by looking at the themes that were mentioned the most commonly across all countries that participated in that process. So they're listed here in the graphic: zero hunger, climate and disaster resilience, healthy diets, reduction of food loss and waste, decent work for food system workers, and the inclusion and empowerment of women and girls through the food system. For each of those 6 goals, we identified 1 or 2 specific policy outcomes that would contribute to it for a total of 10 policy outcomes. For example, for healthy diets, we broke that down into greater consumption of highly nutritious foods and less consumption of unhealthy foods. For each of those 10 outcomes, we then looked at policies across 6 different sectors: health, agriculture, environment, social policies, industrial and economic policies, and trade policies, to see how the policies within that sector contribute to or detract from that goal. The way that was done was by using multiple choice questions, which ask about a specific way in which a policy within that sector could contribute to or detract from that goal. Multiple choice questions were also used for all of the questions within Module 1, again, trying to kind of get some simplicity and some clarity at the same time. And those multiple choice answers were each connected to a simple -3 to +3 scoring system, with -3 representing something that was wholly incoherent or really non-supportive of that policy goal, and +3 reflecting something that was highly coherent or supportive. Methodologically, the tool is applied through a combination of key informant interviews and document review, focusing primarily on key policy documents that are either cross-cutting across all aspects of food or specific to different sectors. That's usually followed by a validation workshop in which the preliminary results from that assessment are presented to key stakeholders who can comment on where they think it's right, where they think maybe it's got something wrong, and as a result, validate the results, while also beginning to have a bit of a conversation about what could we do with these? What might be some of the recommendations that we would have seeing these results in our context? We did test the use of AI chatbots for facilitating this analysis. It didn't end up working that well, so we didn't end up including in the final methods, but I'm happy to talk more about that in the questions if anybody's curious. We scored each individual question, and then we aggregated that into a simple stoplight results scorecards. So stoplight system, kind of green, good, go, red, not so good, stop, and then orange and yellow being intermediate categories within that. This was chosen because it tends to be really easy to interpret and understand, even for stakeholders who aren't super technical. Importantly, the results were paired with recommendations. The tool itself provides generic, non-context specific recommendations, but we advise that it's really important for stakeholders in a particular context to use those as a starting point and develop localized, more specific, more detailed recommendations that would apply within their own context. And as I mentioned before, throughout the application of the tool, we use the results of our initial pilot applications to refine and revise it before we iteratively obtain the final version. To date, it's been applied completely in 10 Asian and African low and middle income countries, and we've done a partial application of all of Module 1 plus parts of Module 2 in the UK and Switzerland. So, the moment you've all been waiting for. What are the results? What have we learned about policy coherence through this application? So I'm presenting here insights from applying the tool in those 10 Asian and African countries. And the graph shown here shows the average scores at the level of the section for Module 1, looking at those structures and mechanisms, across all 10 countries. So you can see the score ranges from 0% up to 100%, and there's one bar per section representing the average score across questions within that section across all 10 countries. And we do find some pretty consistent trends across the different contexts that we studied. Countries tend to be really strong on having in place those framework documents and also having a political commitment to them. So many countries have put in place policies or action plans related to food systems, and they have high-level political commitment that says, I endorse this, I want to achieve this from a political leader. Somewhat strong on coordination structures, so those different ways in which different parts of government come together to talk about food policy issues. But generally, we found there were a fair amount of opportunities for improvement when it came to inclusivity, stakeholder engagement, and voice. So making sure that a wide range of stakeholders are included in food policy development processes. On capacity and implementation, making sure we can actually move from having something on paper to having something implemented in practice, and in particularly on that question of monitoring and accountability, having mechanisms in place to follow up on whether things are actually happening and act accordingly. To make that a bit more specific, I'll zoom in on examples from two countries where we applied the tool, Benin and Pakistan. And I chose these because they offer an interesting contrast, since Benin is kind of very much at the beginning of its journey of thinking about food from a systems approach, whereas Pakistan has been doing this for several years now. So we see some differences across the countries. When it comes to framework documents, you can see in the graphic here, for Pakistan, that got green, good. Pakistan submitted a food system pathway through the UNFSS process back in 2021. It was a pretty strong one, considering multiple different types of food system sectors. It had a clear target date for achieving its goals, specific priorities, measures, and interventions to achieve them. In contrast, for Benin, it scored a yellow, so kind of an intermediate, okay, but could be better kind of outcome. That's because it's still in the process of developing that pathway. Currently, it has a preliminary document that provides a good starting point, but it could be strengthened by including a more specific vision for what it wants to achieve through food system transformation, a more integrated approach that involves different types of sectors and goals, to specify clearer priorities, and to provide targets for achieving them. To give another example, capacity and implementation. We saw a similar trend here where Pakistan, not quite so good as for framework documents, it was in the yellow, but it has made a lot of progress with a formally adopted pathway, an action plan and investment plan being in the course of development, and already conducting some capacity building of government staff on implementing them. Benin, in contrast, much earlier on in the process, it hasn't formally adopted a pathway. It hasn't yet developed an action plan or investment plan, but it has become a bit of government capacity building. Interestingly, the trend was a bit different when it came to monitoring and accountability. So in this case, we saw that for the case of Pakistan, this was the real area where they could work to strengthen. Despite all the strong work that had been done on those framework documents, they were lacking clearly specified performance indicators, monitoring and reporting mechanisms and responsibilities, and they didn't necessarily have in place clear, transparent approaches for reviewing their pathway, improving it over time, and also for assessing different policy impacts across sectors. In contrast, Benin already did have some methods in place for assessing the extent to which policies could have impacts across different sectors, but it still has opportunities for strengthening monitoring through indicators, reporting mechanisms, and responsibilities. Now for Module 2. Again, summarizing here the results across the 10 countries in Africa and Asia that we looked at. And the way that the graph here works is that each row of the graph represents one of the goals that we were looking at, whereas each column represents a policy area. The cell where the row and the column meet is color-coded to represent, on average, across the 10 African and Asian countries that we looked at, the extent to which policies within that area are coherent or incoherent with that specific goal. So for example, if you look in the first cell, that indicates that agriculture policies tend to be highly coherent with the goal of reducing hunger by increasing the supply of main staple crops. And there were several trends that we saw commonly across countries. In general, there are a couple goals for which policies tend to be pretty coherent and widely supporting of them across different sectors, particularly climate change adaptation and having in place nutrition-sensitive social protection systems. But there were also some goals where policies were commonly incoherent and working against them, particularly healthy diets, climate change mitigation, and having adequate wages for food system workers. And if we look in terms of policy areas as opposed to food system goals, we did find that trade policies were one of the common sources of incoherence, with trade policies often being at odds with policy goals across different sectors. To make that a bit more concrete, I pulled out here a few examples of policies where we commonly saw high levels of coherence with different food system goals. So when it comes to climate change adaptation, we saw across many of the different countries that we studied that there's often in place agricultural research and development that looks at developing climate-adapted crops, as well as support for the adoption of climate-smart agricultural practices. Within the health sector, we saw that many countries have policy recognition of climate change as a threat to human health. Within the environment sector, we saw that many countries have in place early warning systems and policy support for them to be able to recognize threats to the food supply related to climate shocks like droughts or floods. And within economic and industrial policies, we do see that many countries have in place tax rebates and subsidies for agriculture and food companies to be able to adapt to climate change. So high levels of coherence in general there. Similarly with social protection, we saw across contexts within health systems, there are often in place policies that support micronutrient supplementation for populations that are at particular risk of undernutrition, things like iron and folic acid for pregnant women or vitamin A for young children, and that many countries have in place emergency cash or food relief that they will bring in after there's been a climate shock to increase the resilience of the population and the food system to those types of shocks. Now, regarding incoherence, some of the examples that we see commonly across different contexts are within agricultural policies. They tend to have some conflicts when it comes to achieving healthy diet goals by providing subsidies for sugar crops and oil crops. Similarly, within the healthy diets goal, we find that there are many countries where the environmental policies don't place any limits on the use of single-use plastic packaging, which you can see in the image here is often enabling the sale and easy, convenient, cheap consumption of unhealthy foods. Many countries lack strong labeling, taxation, and marketing policies that can encourage the consumption of healthy foods or discourage the consumption of unhealthy ones. Many countries within their trade policies have tariffs on the imports of healthy foods, or maybe they don't have them when it comes to unhealthy foods. Within social policies, we see that there's often a lack of supportive regulation on nutrition within the workplace or on nutrition standards for school meals. Another area where we saw a fair amount of incoherence was when it came to climate change mitigation. We found that across many contexts, there remain agricultural policies that are supporting the growth of high emissions agricultural sectors, such as the livestock sector, without clearly putting in measures to ensure that the implications for greenhouse gas emissions and climate change are taken into account and mitigated. We also found within health policies that many food-based dietary guidelines, which are important for structuring different procurement policies and recommendations throughout the policy universe, don't consider climate implications or environmental sustainability implications when they're making those food recommendations and focus solely on health concerns. So, giving you a sample of what the tool looks like and some of the results, so how could this be used? Well, we hope that there are a number of different use cases when it comes to research. For example, being able to systematically analyze and compare policy coherence across contexts and over time, and also to be able to test some relationships between policy coherence and other aspects. I mentioned before that Module 1 was designed to be looking at structures and mechanisms that might encourage the achievement of coherent policies, but there isn't really clear evidence of that yet. It's mostly based on what we think are good practices, what we've seen done in potentially successful cases within practice. But now that there's a consistent, coherent way to measure this, there's the opportunity for additional research that could really test the relationship between having those structures and mechanisms in place and achieving more coherent outcomes or achieving positive outcomes within the food system more broadly. Within the space of practice, so actually developing and putting in place policies, we hope that this tool and the results from it can help people to better understand policy coherence as a concept, that it can put some real practical, specific, contextual examples of both good practice and areas of incoherence to add some more texture to something that can sometimes be an abstract concept. We hope that the tool can be useful for identifying specific areas for improvement, which can then be the target for advocacy and policy reform efforts. We hope that by identifying different strengths and weaknesses in policy approaches across contexts, that can support cross-context learning, taking what's really being done well in one context and maybe sharing that with other countries that have some room to grow in that particular dimension of policy coherence. So before I conclude, just need to note some limitations and caveats to the tool. A lot of these are due to that need to kind of retain simplicity without becoming overly simplistic that I've mentioned a few times. But one of the key ones that we had to bring in as a result of that aim of remaining user-friendly was that it doesn't look at actual implementation. So the tool looks at policies as written, and it doesn't examine the potential gap between a policy on paper and a policy in practice, even though we do know that that can be quite large in practice. We only considered 6 goals and a handful of policy areas for each, while of course there could be opportunities for greatly expanding the scope. We simplified the questions, the answers to use multiple choice approach, as well as the analysis to use that kind of stoplight system in the ease of interpretation. This is a one-shot in time analysis, looking using standard questions across context, whereas we know that policy is highly dynamic and context specific. As a result of all of these different limitations, it's really important to emphasize that interpretation of the results is really crucial, and the output should be seen as just the start of a discussion with key stakeholders who are particularly knowledgeable about that particular context and the goals and priorities within it. But I do hope that those limitations and caveats aside, the Food Systems Policy Coherence tool has been able to highlight various different examples of good practices in action, as well as opportunities for improvement. And that going forward, it can serve as an entry point for conversations that are being had with policymakers, as well as for additional research on how to improve coherence to accelerate food systems transformation. If you'd like to learn more, there are a number of different resources that are available. If you look on the left-hand side of your screen, you can scan that QR code or visit the URL there to access the toolkit, including the tool itself and a user's manual for applying it, as well as results brief for those 10 African and Asian countries where we've applied it. And on this webinar today, before this audience, I'm particularly excited to announce that just today, we published a working paper based on the application of the tool, module 1 of the tool, to the UK context. This work was done by Niamh Kelly, who is a PhD student in the City University program and did an internship with GAIN last semester. And she did a really excellent and interesting analysis of how policy coherence is manifesting in current UK food strategies. So please do scan that QR code or visit that web link to access the paper and learn more. Thanks very much to everybody for listening. And of course, thanks to the different donors who have supported this project. And I'll be really interested to hear any questions or comments that you might have about the work. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Stella. What a really interesting and detailed look under the bonnet of your not only policy coherence as it applies to food systems, but also this new tool that you've developed. Thank you so much. And it's, I guess I sometimes feel it's unusual to find so much detail of how we can manage policy coherence or deal with it and think about ways to manage it or ways to analyze it. So really great to have a tool to add to the arsenal of methods that we can use to manage these things. So thanks for running us through that. And I'm sure there's lots of people who are now having a look at it and having a look at the papers that you shared. And great to see Niamh's work published from her work with you earlier this year. So we have loads of questions and I have, which is great to see and great to see so many people on the call. I've tried my best to sort of group them in some way. We've still got some questions coming in, so bear with me and I hope I can get through them all. So the first sort of set of questions are around the process around the tool. Roxana asked, the evaluation must be problematic in most of these countries with all these modules and sectors and questions and quite complicated. And related to that, Jonathan Gilbert has asked, who do you think would be filling out the tool? And presumably, is it a cross-sector group? Is it an individual? So sort of who and how difficult is it, or do you think it's going to be for people to use the tool?
Yeah, those are great questions. So we have applied it in 10 countries to date, as I mentioned. To date, that has mostly been, I would say, people who work with policy think tanks have been kind of the main ones steering that, as in think tanks within the local country context, usually working with civil servants or policymakers within that context. We do think that that first module of the tool really is very user-friendly, and that it could be used fairly easily by anybody who's pretty familiar with that policy context without taking an onerous amount of time. So I think the estimate I gave earlier is about right. Somebody who's really good expert could do it within a couple of hours. Somebody who, would need to do a bit more groundwork, maybe a couple of days, but not more than that. Module 2 is a bit of another story. It did end up becoming quite a lot of questions, and they get pretty detailed. So it does take some time to apply. I think the benefit, though, of having the multiple choice questions is that helps to remove a bit of the need for kind of expert knowledge necessarily from it, right? So you don't need to come with kind of a knowledge of all of these different types of policies and goals and what might be the ways that they manifest in terms of being coherent or incoherent, but it's really broken down into a multiple choice question with, I think, at most 4 response options. So that does simplify it quite a lot. We think that kind of the main users of the tool going forward would, as kind of direct appliers of the tool, would probably be researchers, obviously, but also those who work in civil society, kind of not the high level policymakers, but those who inform them, right? As well as civil society and advocacy groups that work to kind of shape the policy development process. We would hope that kind of the eventual results coming out of it could be useful to policymakers kind of across the spectrum of leadership. Yeah.
Thank you. And I guess one of the other questions that's coming out again from Roxana and others sort of asking, who is doing this and what impact that might have. And one of the issues, I guess, with policy coherence analysis is how you kind of bring that evidence to the fore. How can you evidence to give your scoring of your +3 to -3? So I was wondering, is there a need for people to come up with evidence when they're analysing the policy documents? How do you, or are you expecting people with enough knowledge in their own experience and in their own heads to be able to do this without having to undergo kind of lengthy analysis processes?
Yeah, so in each question in the tool, we kind of have each answer associated with a score, right? So if the answer is yes, then in a given question, that might be a +3 or a +2, right? So the scoring is pretty easy to do because it's basically just a question of choosing the right answer among the multiple choice questions. We did make it so that when one fills out the tool, one should provide justification, right? Because there is some interpretation that happens, right? Because there are some where the answer kind of is in between two, right? And there is a little bit of a judgment call that needs to be made. But as long as there's kind of an explanation given, then it's helpful to kind of be able to interpret that explanation and verify, is this the appropriate choice in this case? But we do also have a user's manual that walks through in detail kind of many of the different explanations for the question and provides examples of that and different things that might lead to different answers within that. So again, it will always be a bit of a fuzzy topic to study, right? But we think that by kind of breaking it down into very specific questions with very specific multiple choice answers and predefined scoring, that can help to at least kind of simplify it a fair amount, though it'll never make it fully automated.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. And the next kind of set of questions really relates to more of the kind of nitty-gritty in the analysis a little bit to kind of build on that last question. Sunela has asked, what are some methods that can be used to monitor and ensure accountability? For example, what measures are they using in the example you gave of Benin? And there was somebody asking really interested in the AI chatbot. A couple of people asking about that. So whether you can elaborate on that as well.
Yeah, sure. Happy to take both of those on. So with monitoring and accountability, I would say I think that monitoring, it's fairly clear that at least a minimum standard that one should take is having some clearly defined goals and some ways to assess them, right? So if you don't have anything that's like, this is, what we'd like to achieve in terms of hunger reduction or an increase in dietary diversity or reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from our food system, you don't have clear indicators and targets set out, there's not much that can really be the foundation for ensuring accountability later on. So I think that would be the first recommendation. It's something that we saw across many different contexts, is that there's no real specified indicators for success or failure, right? So you can't really even start the accountability conversation if you don't have goals that are clearly enough defined that you could say whether or not they've been achieved. So having those indicators in place, and then importantly, having clearly defined responsibilities for actually reporting on them and making sure that that data gets into the public domain would all be kind of, I think, the first steps in that process. The way that where Benin scored well on that was on kind of a approach, I would say, to preempt the question of monitoring in a sense of doing assessments, cross-sectoral assessments of policy impacts. So kind of an assessment before you put in place a policy of what might be the different impacts of that policy across sectors. And as a result, that gives you kind of a starting point for figuring out if we know that there might be some negative ramifications of this policy that we're putting in place for environmental reasons on health outcomes, then we know that we can monitor those health outcomes, right? If we know that's where the negative outcomes might come from, then we have a target for what we should focus on when it comes to monitoring and avoiding adverse outcomes later on. So that kind of cross-sectoral assessment of policy impacts, I think, is an important good practice in that space that is already being adopted in some places. Regarding the AI chatbots, so yes, this was one of those things, again, seemed like a really good idea beforehand, right? It takes so long to read and analyze policy documents. Chatbots, shouldn't they be able to do it for us? So we did actually develop a custom chatbot for the case of Bangladesh that we were hoping would kind of be a way to test the usefulness of chatbots for doing this type of policy coherence analysis, but also just to serve as a way for any interested user, even that's an ordinary citizen or somebody in civil society, to understand more about the local policies. So we went and got a curated set of food policies for Bangladesh, cleaned and prepared them so that the AI chatbot could draw directly on them, set up a whole chatbot interface where users could kind of put in plain language questions and get those answers back from the policies. We found that it worked really well for helping users understand what was in the policies. It didn't work very well for understanding policy coherence because the chatbots are not very good at comparing things. So comparing document 1 to 2 or comparing across sectors. And they also run into a bit of a challenge in terms of being exhaustive. So it might be the case that they would find one example of something and then they would, it would stop looking. It would just give you the answer like that, even if there were 10 other mentions of that in the document that might entail kind of contradictions or elaborations or something wholly different. So from a policy coherence analysis standpoint, yeah, it wasn't great. But it was a good experiment. It sounded like it might have worked. Yeah,
There are limits to AI,
there are.
thankfully.
There are.
Yeah, but good to try those things and to see where it can do and what it can do, and great to have that experience to be able to reflect upon. And who knows in the future where we might be going with that, or where that might be useful in for
Indeed.
further iterations of the tool. There were a couple of questions about the kind of country context or the country choices. Emery Jocelyn has asked so thank you for the insightful presentation. Curious to know how you chose the 10 countries, and interested in hearing geographical representation, especially in the African countries. And then also a couple of questions around one from Meredith Bryson, who's just saying, can you elaborate on the outcomes of applying the tool to the UK as well as to the translation of the tool to high income countries? So those two sort of ends of the scale.
Yep, definitely. So the countries to choose were frankly a bit of a convenient sample. They're the countries where GAIN is working, and they're the countries where the donor-funded project that supported this work was focusing on. So those were kind of the countries where we had budget and access to stakeholders to be able to apply the tool. I think they do have some biases, in particular, kind of by definition, GAIN has been working there to improve food policy. So nearly all of the countries had already kind of been involved in food systems policy processes, most of them through the UNFSS process, but some in other ways. If you took a random selection of countries across Africa and Asia, my guess is you wouldn't see as high of scores in that, just because, again, kind of the selection bias was such that this was focused on countries that were kind of already engaged within the food systems policy space. It also means that we don't have any representative of Latin America, of course, which is a large region for low and middle income countries that isn't as well represented here. Also, Central Asia, Middle East, and North Africa tend to be underrepresented in the sample that we're looking at. So that's some limitations there. Within the sub-Saharan African countries, I think it's a reasonably representative sample. So we have a couple West African countries, we have a couple East African countries, we have a couple Southern African countries, one Southern African country. So overall, overall is getting kind of different parts of the continent, and countries also that come from slightly different policy traditions. So some that are coming from maybe the Francophone Africa, French influenced policy, as well as Anglophone and Lusophone countries, which kind of all bring with them different, structures related to policy due to their history. And high income countries. So, in terms of the specific results for the UK, I am going to direct you to that working paper where you can look at that in all the details. But in general, so we did again start out with this as a focus on low and middle income countries, but hoping that it could be applied to high income countries as well with some adaptation. I think what we feel at this point, having fully applied it in those 10 countries and applied parts of it in high income countries, is that the first module is pretty applicable across all country settings. That one that looks at structures and mechanisms for governance that might support policy coherence. I think I don't think there was anything there that jumped out as being only relevant in a low and middle income country setting, or anything that's like a glaring gap from a high income country setting. I think that's also very helpful because it is a case where we see that there maybe are some lessons that can be learned from low and middle income countries to high income countries and vice versa, which I think is an interesting place to be able to look and share lessons across contexts. Now, with the second module that really gets into the details of coherence among policies and different food systems goals, I would say the same answer holds about 80 to 90%, in that a lot of the context works, a lot of questions, a lot of the topics are still applicable in high income country settings, but there are a few where it probably needs some tweaking to be well applied. To give you an example of that, the kind of first policy goal that we looked at was zero hunger, so reduction of hunger. And within the low and middle income country context, we focus that primarily on a question of staple crops and kind of affordability of those staple crops and availability, both because that's such a large component of people's diets in those settings, and because so many people are directly working in agriculture, right? So kind of staple crops influences them on both sides. If we're looking in a high income country setting, in most places, those are really not that applicable, right, to the questions of hunger, which tend to be much more about the income and ability to pay side of the equation. So that would need a fair amount of adjustment, but also I think some more kind of critical thinking of if we want to take a food system specific and food specific approach, what can we say about policies to kind of improve income, improve purchasing power, because that tends to go well beyond the food system, aside from the people who work directly in the food system. So that's one area where I think a fair amount of adaptation is needed. But I think there's also some others where maybe we had conversations along the way of somebody saying, "Ooh, this one wouldn't really be applied to a high income country." And we're like, well, are we sure about that, right? Is that maybe some of our biases and some of our assumptions about what is and is not an issue in high income versus low and middle income country contexts? So to give you an example of that, there are some questions in the agriculture module that ask about biofortification. So breeding crops to have higher levels of micronutrients. And that was something that was flagged by a few people along the way of, oh, don't think this is really relevant to high income countries. But we do actually see that most high income countries still have persistently high levels of some micronutrient deficiencies. And people still are eating a fair amount of staple foods within those countries that don't have high levels of micronutrient content. So maybe that's an example where we need to think beyond that binary of high income versus low and middle income country contexts and think instead about what are kind of the policy goals here. And are there maybe ways in which, again, we could learn from low and middle income countries as opposed to kind of assuming that the learning only goes in one direction? You know what I mean?
Yeah, so I think that there may be things that we can learn by looking a bit under the bonnet rather than simply looking at the areas of development or income related. So yeah, that's a
Yeah.
really great insight, I guess, from being able to do such detailed analysis and hopefully make that analysis a bit easier by a really structured, well-structured tool. A couple of questions, more questions about the kind of the I guess the questions and the analysis. Two people, at least, Elise Iruhirie, I'm sorry if I've pronounced that wrong, and Roberto Fernandez are both asking how is political commitment measured? And I guess that's kind of, or defined, and I guess that's maybe would come up as a question around a lot of these different areas that you're looking at, sort of how do you define that, or is it defined within the tool, or is it up to the user to sort of define that themselves? And for a second one, along a similar lines, looking at the kind of the nuts and bolts, Asa Geertz has asked, did you assess policy coherence in terms of public expenditure allocation, especially between sectors?
Yeah, so for the first one, so for kind of every topic that we're looking at, there's specific multiple choice questions with specific answers that are kind of reflecting that. So you can go and look at the tool online and see kind of exactly what those are. Within module 1, the one on structures and mechanisms, by memory, there's about 5 questions per section. Some have fewer and some have more. And for the political commitment section, I think we were looking at kind of whether there had been a high-level leader who had publicly expressed support for either a specific food policy or strategy, so if they had publicly endorsed that policy or strategy, or for a kind of food systems approach more generally. So leadership has come out publicly at a high level to say, we are on board with this approach, we are supportive of this particular policy. And then we also had a question that was within that section that was looking at whether there were mechanisms in place to ensure kind of the continuity of that political commitment across electoral cycles. So different answers for that could include things like, did different political parties include this in their party platforms, the endorsement of the food strategy? Was there continuity of kind of civil servants and people involved in the bureaucracy across different cycles of government who would have kind of kept that approach alive despite turnover in government? So a few different response options there, and each of those were associated with a particular score, again going from +3 down below that. So those resulted in the overall scores for the level of the domain that I summarized earlier.
Thank you. We've had a
Was there a
couple of
second question there that I missed?
one was around the no, I think you
I got
covered
them. Okay. Yeah.
them both, I think.
Yeah.
So a couple of questions around food loss and waste. So Natalia has asked, for example, she's surprised to see such highly coherent results for food loss and waste. Do you have any sort of concrete examples on that? And can you give examples of which countries where things, which could be considered best examples?
Yeah, food loss and waste is a good one. I think this is one where the weakness of the tool in terms of the gap between what's on paper and what's on practice probably is particularly large, because I think food loss and waste is one of these where the commitment to reduce it is there, and it's kind of the devil is in the details of implementing it. But so some of the policies that were asked about with regards to food loss and waste reduction that I'm thinking about were, for example, public support for improving infrastructure, so improving kind of transportation and storage infrastructure to reduce post-harvest losses would be one example. Within the trade context, there were a couple questions that looked about kind of processes to facilitate speedy customs and border clearance so that goods kind of didn't spoil while they were waiting for that, and the extent to which there were approaches in place that could ensure that that happened quickly. For the specific countries that did particularly well on that, I think I'll direct you towards the website to kind of look in more detail at that, because right offhand, I can't particularly remember which ones were the real standouts on that. Yeah.
That's fair enough. I'm sure you can't remember all the data from all 10 countries, but yeah, thank you for giving that answer. A couple kind of questions about how we might use the tool or use the results from the tool. So a couple of people have asked, is there translation to other countries, for example? Would it be applicable to Latin America? So an anonymous attendee asked about Spain, and another one about the Latin American context, maybe the same person, and kind of how it aligns with other tools. So Sasha Lamstein has asked, how does this tool and these findings align with the food systems dashboard? And is it used by the dashboard, or could it be, I guess, integrated into the dashboard? And I guess kind of from Harm Wiltzing, sort of what are your comments and tips to apply these in a policy context, to apply the insights? What would be your kind of thoughts and comments and tips? about how to apply these. So
Yep.
basically, can it be applied to other countries and
Yep.
other languages? And then how do we apply these in high-income countries? And then the
Yep.
dashboard. Sorry, I'm
Yep. Sure.
overloading you with questions. There's
No,
so
no
many.
problem. Okay, so first one on applying across different contexts. I think that there is nothing that would prevent it from being useful and applied well within Latin America, even though we didn't do that. As I mentioned, we did apply it across very diverse different countries, kind of all from the spectrum of low income up to middle income, and again, bringing in some high income countries spanning Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Europe. And I think through that, we probably confirmed. Most of the questions and the scoring approach would apply across other similar countries in different regions. In terms of language, we only have English language versions of the tool available at the moment, though we do have French and Portuguese results briefs for Benin and for Mozambique, in addition to the English language versions. But I think it would be pretty easy to take the current tool and, again, use an AI translation to put it into another language, and then of course proofread it very carefully, but apply it that way. I think most of the things that we're looking at here are pretty applicable across contexts. Again, particularly for module 1, and with some of the caveats for module 2 that I mentioned earlier. Um, on the food systems dashboard, that's an interesting question, because kind of some of the original inspiration for this work came from work that we did on a project related to the food systems dashboard called the Food Systems Countdown Initiative, which tries to kind of monitor food systems across all their different domains. And one of the challenges we had in that piece of work is that when it comes to indicators related to governance, there actually aren't that many indicators that are specific to governance within the food space that we could find and that were available across a large number of countries. And so we honed in on, policy coherence for food systems. Wouldn't it be great if there was an indicator on that? And that was kind of part of the genesis for this project originally. We would hope over time that particularly that first module of the tool, that again is pretty light and easy to apply, is something that could be applied across a wide number of countries and eventually make that kind of broad cross-country data set available. But for the food systems dashboard specifically, we have kind of a floor on how many countries we need to have before we include data on the dashboard, because it's meant to be kind of a global tool for comparing data across all different countries in the world. We want to make sure that there are at least 40 data points, so data from 40 different countries of the world, before we put data on it. And unfortunately, we're not quite there yet in this one, but maybe ask back in a year or two, and hopefully we'll be able to put some data from this project on there. And then, yes, the
Presumably,
final one was tips for actually applying it in the policy space, I believe. So yeah, good question. I think coming back to kind of one of the points I concluded, I think it's really important to see the output of the analysis as the start of a conversation within a specific context. And in particular, I think in that the tool shows areas where on paper, in policies, or in the structures of governance within that country, it looks like there might be areas of coherence and incoherence. Sometimes those actually aren't real coherence in practice because there's a good reason, right? Sometimes there are trade-offs that we have to make among different food systems goals, and those are carefully evaluated, and a decision is made. We're going to put in place this policy, even though we know it might have some negative effects on other sectors, because we think it's so important for this particular sector, and we already have in place measures to mitigate those negative effects, right? So a first tip is to examine, is this a real area of incoherence? Or is it something that looks on paper like incoherence, but maybe actually was thought through and makes sense within that context? I think a second point to consider is the fact that policy incoherence does sometimes exist for a reason. Some of these areas of policy incoherence are the result of political economy and kind of power imbalances within the food system and the challenges of negotiating those within a particular context. I think one of the key examples of that has to do with agricultural subsidies, right? So in many countries, it's a bit of an open secret that the agricultural subsidies that are in place don't make a lot of sense from either a health or, in some cases, an environmental perspective, and it would be a lot better to not have those kind of subsidies on crops that are maybe not super supportive of human health or of the environment. Yet those subsidies persist because there are often very powerful agricultural lobbies behind them that have a particularly outsized power within that system. So, for example, speaking from the context of the United States, a lot of states where there are a lot of agricultural lobby groups are also ones that are important from the context of electoral math and, who ends up controlling which districts and who ends up being in the office of president. That is such a politically important and sensitive topic that you're just not going to get that much traction by focusing in on it, if even if you know that it is a key area of incoherence. So I think you need to use those lenses of political economy and, power to think about where can we actually move the needle, where can we really focus on, where there's an area of policy incoherence that is not there for a particularly good reason, or where we think we could bring together enough stakeholders who are kind of on the other side of that issue to be able to kind of overturn that and use those to really prioritize how do we want to improve policies, how do we want to transform the policy space to be better supporting of our food systems. It's a long battle, right? To kind of change policies and to engage in policy advocacy and policy reform. So I think this is one tool in the process of diagnosis, but it also needs to be taken into consideration with the political economy considerations.
Yeah, really interesting. And we know more now than ever, perhaps, the fast changing nature of policy change, and things can turn around very, very quickly in a matter of moments to something, completely the reverse of what it was before. And interesting, I guess, then people may be needing to use your tool over and again to try to reanalyze the coherence. And yeah, I guess that's a kind of interesting to think about that. So as we move, we still have so many questions. I apologize. I've tried to get through as many by grouping them together as I can. Apologies if I haven't been able to ask your question of Stella. Just a couple more to sort of round up just around the kind of use. So a really nice question from an anonymous attendee who's a part of a PhD collaborative platform. Could they use your tool to apply in different countries? And I suppose importantly then how to kind of use the tool if they wanted to publish the results. So what's the kind of use of the tool for people listening? Can they use it for research? And yeah, what's the restrictions?
Yes, please. Yes, please do go ahead. We've made everything publicly available. So the tool itself, the scoring guide, the user's manual, all of that are available on the website that I shared. So everybody can go and access it there. If you go and you look at it and you do think that it's something that you want to use, either applying it directly or adapting it to your particular question or context, that's great. You're very welcome to. We would be really happy to see it being used. Do feel free to send me an email and let me know what you're doing with it, because that would just be really nice to hear what people are doing. And I'm also happy to answer any kind of more detailed questions that people have about the methodology that was used for it. But I do think there's a lot of opportunity for kind of taking it, applying it in different places, and also adapting it in different directions. And maybe, using that data in combination with different types of data to answer other research questions that are about policy coherence and how it can interact with or affect or be influenced by different aspects within food policy or food systems. So yes, please.
Thank you. So I think one of the other kind of questions or points that you made in the presentation was around really interesting to see the kind of overview from those 10 countries of where you found coherence and where you found incoherence, and maybe not surprising to look at those policies and see that it's the monitoring and the so there's some good intentions, and then when it actually comes to living up to those intentions. I wondered whether there was any thoughts you had on how we could improve that, sort of having seen that and having seen those results. Are there ways that you can think of where you see the accountability, and does the tool allow you to kind of go back and try to advocate for more accountability, about accountability, as it were, not to get too meta about this?
Yeah. Yes, I would hope so. I think the tool results kind of even in countries that were doing really well in other areas, that was a weakness across nearly all of them was the monitoring and accountability parts. So hopefully we can use those results to kind of shine a light on, look, you're doing so great at all these other parts of the process, but still lagging behind in this last one. At the same time, I think we should be realistic that it's a fairly new process, right? Of thinking about food systems with a systems approach and putting out these cross-sectoral policies, so it does take a while to kind of catch up. For different types of monitoring, I think there are a number of good approaches out there that can be used. I think it's useful to think about both the process and the outcomes. So monitoring the actual outcomes of food systems and are they what they want to be. For that, I would mention actually the initiative that I mentioned a few minutes ago, the Food Systems Countdown Initiative, which was really founded for this purpose. It was during UNFSS and recognizing that there was no accountability mechanism in place and identifying a concise set of indicators that for which there are data across nearly all countries that could be used to monitor transformation. I think those data are publicly available and they're reported on every year for progress. So that's, I think, a great starting point for countries that are interested in doing it, and also for civil society and researchers that want to be able to kind of hold them to account. I do think there is a challenge when it comes to accountability, right? Because monitoring is kind of the first step in that monitoring and accountability process. And you can't do too much for accountability if you don't have monitoring in place, but just having monitoring in place and being able to say, hey, we're not doing what we said we would do, what's up? It only gets you partway there, right? So I think that is a much bigger challenge in terms of accountability, and that really gets back to broader governance structures of who is held to account, to ensure that these promises are actually followed through on. It connects a bit back to the point on political commitment, right? That if there is kind of a high level endorsement of this strategy that we have said that we want to achieve, that has gone all the way up to the prime minister publicly committing to it, and that has within it specific targets with a specific end date, with specific indicators to measure them, that's a really strong starting point for somebody to be able to say, hey, Mr. Prime Minister, I think we have an election coming up. Let's check your report card and how we're doing on those different indicators. But there's a lot of room, I would say, for more good practices and good examples to come out of countries or cities that have managed to do this well, and civil society and researchers that have been able to help in that process. So lots of work to do, but yeah.
Lots of work to do, and hopefully this can help us do it. And with a group of researchers listening, I'm sure they'll all be going away to explore how to use these tools in their own work. So we've reached the end of our time, I'm afraid. Thanks to everybody who joined. Thanks in particular to Stella for coming and answering questions so brilliantly, no matter how many I threw at you. Thanks for a brilliant exploration of this tool. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. And just to let you know again that next month we welcome Professor Charlotte Bilkoff on the 22nd of October, so do save that date and sign up to attend. Thanks again, Stella, and goodbye, everybody.